His Excellency Malay Mishra, the Indian High Commission to Trinidad and Tobago, and staff of the High Commission, members of the academic fraternity, fellow presenters, students, ladies and gentlemen. On December 13th, 2010, CXC's registrar, Dr. Jules, made a very startling admission. He said the unfortunate reality is that post-colonial education has never fundamentally questioned the colonial inheritance. A new vehicle for human transformation is required. To me, that's a very sad reflection of 50 years of formal education in this country. However, it is most instructive in the context of my own presentation. While the formal educational systems had significant weaknesses and appeared to be failing, informal learning employed by the East Indians have culminated today to be a story of phenomenal success. While formal education after independence sought structure and conformity, the informal cultural teachings of the indentured laborers applied old philosophy and a living faith, seen as the most valid and foundational vehicle to drive cultural transference in the minds and hearts of the indentured laborers. In looking at the historical evolution of educational links from the Indian perspective, cultural transference and learning that did take place was not generally through the formal educational systems, but rather through the informal. For the East Indian, education was a living example, passed on from one generation to the next. Learning was therefore at home. It would be disingenuous of me to talk to you about the knowledge of Indian culture, religion, or philosophy as evidence of formal educational links between India and Trinidad and Tobago. These are, in fact, prime examples of internalized cultural retention and cultural renewal from the ancient passed on through the indentured laborers. The socialization of the children under the Indian traditions followed a very profound ethos of the estate workers, putting above all education and family. They understood what Sugarman in 1970 identified as deferred gratification, where the Indian families gave up short-term benefits for long-term educational goals. Many of us today are in fact the recipients of such noble sacrifices. We heard stories of meals of roti and salt, condensed milk and biscuit, so that books and candles may be bought instead. And this taught us the value of sacrifice, not only for the East Indians, but the children of the freed African slaves, the Chinese immigrants, and the remaining Amerindians among us. This obtained as true. Even as far back as 1988, Alan Harris, writing for the Trinidad and Tobago Review, lamented the formal educational program undertaken by Dr. Eric Williams, in his words, as elitist, even exclusive, as a stock of ideas would have held very little appeal to the wider population, whose diverse cultural traditions were quite alien to the formal educational program. There seemed to be a disconnect between the cultural traditions of our many ethnic groups and the content of curriculum mandated at the schools. Today I say without fear or hesitation, but with tremendous admiration, it was the indomitable spirit and determination of our forefathers, rather than any sustained effort of any political or state educational group, that today allows us to boast of a very high multicultural society wherever in the world we speak. As we take stock of the last 50 years, and as we prepare for the next 50, we must live up to the heritage that was passed on, and to recall the inner strength and vitality not only of India, but of Africa, China, and Europe, as we carve our own pathway to progress. I believe the time is here when we must claim ownership of our future and what we must become tomorrow. Resilience and sacrifice are part of the legacy from our ancestors. The more I tried to assess the evolution of the educational linkages between India and Trinidad and Tobago, it became clearer that the real wisdom was passed on outside of the school, oftentimes in spite of the formal structures. This cultural value system formed the foundation that allowed us success at every other formal and informal institution presented to us as children of the indenture. What was taught in the home allowed many to achieve significantly outside and even within the schools. The World Economic Forum refers to two requisite phases for any innovation to take place in any country. A creative phase, which calls forth the internal dynamism and value system of the people, and the second phase, which is the execution phase. And it is said, perspiration in that one is far greater than the inspiration. Therefore, by extension, the inspiration comes in the first phase. From an educational perspective, the ingrained cultural value system from the Indian tradition in Trinidad and Tobago conforms to the phase one, which allows us to leap into the next level of innovation. And certainly, Nirad and Dr. Chandradatsan would talk about the innovation. In this context, the family was the chief agent of socialization and was the successful institution of learning from the Indian perspective. Home was a historical school for the East Indian tradition. It was Malik, in 1971, who identified, and I quote, "In the rural areas of Trinidad and Tobago where most of the Indians live, family is still the magic word. It is through the stable family system that the Indian is thriving." This is in 1971. Learning derived from doing arti to our parents and elders, from fasting during Ramadan and Diwali to the Islamic tradition of zakat or giving charity. The victory of knowledge over ignorance was symbolized by the lighting of the diya to dispel darkness. Many children lit their diyas before school, and Saraswati Puja was done before every major exam. And through this we were taught devotion and humility. Learning for indented children resided in family units that encouraged nuclear and extended living arrangements to take care of several generations at once. Bhagwa, or Holi, taught us the oneness of humanity beyond creed or race. Our Guru was revered and respected. Tvameva Mata, Chapita Tvameva. Our mother, father, elders, we were taught how to respect each and everyone. Disrespect was not tolerated. Raksha Bandhan cemented bonds of friendship and protection for siblings, brothers and sisters. Karma taught us the value of law, consequence, and effect. The unrelenting pursuit of non-violence in understanding shared humanity is a cornerstone of Indian philosophy. Even here, far from the Indian subcontinent, we revered Mahatma Gandhi and spoke his name with pride. Tolerance and non-aggression were taught and encouraged in the Indian households. For the Indian, the greater challenge was to conform to what was the official curriculum and to balance between the internal and the external environments. Traditional Indian notions of family, worship, faith, and belief significantly found weak reflection in the formal education. In the words of Parasnath Lakshmi Prasad Sharma, whom most of you know as Lionel Frank Sukran, campaigned against the imposition of English as a prerequisite to vote in the 1940s. In his words, he said, "When I contemplate the sons and daughters of Indian immigrants being turned away from schools simply because of their apparel, language, race, or religion, when I recall the discrimination that I too suffered, and the number of Indians who had to forsake their religion and change their names to get $4 a month for a job, I know I could have done no less. With the convergence of the comprehensive school system in the 1980s in Trinidad and Tobago, formal education became even more unfriendly. More and more, poor reflection of traditional Amerindian, African, Indian, or Chinese philosophy plagued those who were not considered mainstream. A deep void was created. Heavy criticism of this comprehensive school system adopted from the national curriculum in England came from many areas, but a very stinging criticism came from a respected Cambridge professor, Jeff Whitty, in 1989, and he had this to say: "This myopic curriculum is based very much on the limited Anglo-Saxon view of the world and excludes the experience of Asian, African, and Caribbean groups in our society. And so this void had to be filled. And it is to the credit of the denominational institutions, the SDMS, the ASHA, SWAHA, and the Presbyterian boards, that provided a culturally responsive environment for many in our society. And the growth of these institutions reflect an innovative response to what was seen as a threat of cultural erasure. In fact, the report of the High-Level Committee on the Indian Diaspora in 2000 confirmed that by 1921, the Indian diaspora in Trinidad only began to scale daunting heights as they gradually established a number of denominational religious institutions, added to which, for every mosque and temple, a school was built next to or opposite. As Professor Laguerre pointed out in Calcutta to Karani, he said the establishment of schools in their own denominations in the 1940s and the 1950s marked the beginning of a new era for many Indians. I believe it was short-sighted that formal educational institutions in Trinidad and Tobago then chose to continue what is seen as a colonial pattern of curriculum, rather than capitalize on the wealth of the ancient wisdom of the Indian and Asian subcontinent. It is my deepest conviction that our national curriculum must again be revised to incorporate a more balanced philosophical value system. Any curriculum revision must take into account what Dr. Arnold Toynbee, a renowned historian, said in 1954. At this moment in human history, a way of salvation for mankind is the Indian way. Gandhi's principle of nonviolence and Sri Ramakrishna's testimony to the harmony of religions, an attitude and spirit to grow, the alternative to which is destruction. Ironically, these traditions, which existed outside of formal classrooms, more and more became milestone achievements celebrated by all communities in Trinidad and Tobago. Diwali and Eid became national celebrations along with Christmas and Easter. The 3-day wedding became a community celebration. Roti and doubles became national dishes along with kalalu and pilau. Hundreds mourned together at our cremation sites. How could we forget? How could we forget Shah Mohammed, who brought us Mastana Bahar in the 1980s? A social consciousness found root through the advent of Indian film and the ever-popular Sunday matinee. Indians and non-Indians alike cried at the Indian films which mesmerized our nation for hours as we watched Hema Malini, Dharmendra, and Amitabh Bachchan on the silver screen. Mukesh and Lata brought us to tears on a Sunday. This was education at work. The weaving of the family traditions around music and song in Indian film. Yoga and meditation became magnets for all, searching for a higher consciousness. It was no longer an Indian thing. Indian concerts featuring Lata Mangeshkar, Anup Jalota, Kunal Ganjalwala, our own Sam Budram, Sandra Sukhdev, Shivanand Maharaj, Rana and Susan Mohit, Nival Cheklal, they all grew as a result. While these cultural traditions and practices became part of our own social orientation, they remain, unfortunately, token topics in our history and social studies curriculum. While the teachings were never fully explored by mainstream curriculum, the deeper and more profound learning was taking place in the towns and villages throughout our country. In the evolution of links between this society and that of India, we salute the sugarcane estate workers who, more than in many schoolmasters, quietly passed on their knowledge from one generation to the next. So much of our learning took place in the reading of the Ramayana. The symbolism of the Ramayana was unprecedented and taught us of love, honor, and family. Hanuman became our national symbol of justice and honor and loyalty. Ram, Lakshman, Bharat, and Sita became popular children names. These lessons were unforgettable. There was no formal classroom. It was felt, it was lived. So much of our respect was taught when the explanation of the construction of the bedi used in the puja. The massaging of babies with coconut oil was used, and this oil, along with saffron, neem, and tulsi for almost any ailment, is today a source of significant scientific research in Western and European continents. It would seem, therefore, that the evolution of the education from India to this part of the world was through practice and effort, while life itself was being lived. If our educational link is to remain a success story, however, we must propel from that first phase of the innovative experience to the execution phase in our drive for sustainable innovation and increased capacity in Trinidad and Tobago. One of the areas that India focused on very early in its curriculum was that of environment and population and social economics. Since 1976, environmental education was included in every level of schooling in India, along with population studies, environmental engineering, and environmental health. But even before, the issue of social economics was being taught in India in the 1990s. This concept was first advocated by Mahatma Gandhi as a radical philosophy. Unto this last, when he used it, it was used to mean that the least among us, the most voiceless and defenseless, should be the starting point of all material developmental activities. Even as early as 1988, with India as a focal point, India-born Professor C.K. Prahalad took the idea, bottom of the pyramid, to a global level and challenged our management gurus and experts today to create new business models targeted at the fastest growing markets and entrepreneurial opportunities found among billions of the very poor among us. For us in Trinidad and Tobago, this concept may very well have been used since the days of independence. However, it was used to create a program of welfare and dependence, which reflects a very poor understanding of this social concept of innovative entrepreneurship. We adopted a spiritual concept without the requisite philosophical understanding. And today, unfortunately, we pay a very heavy price, both in financial and social costs, because of that misunderstanding. Innovation lies not in the infrastructural construct of more buildings or equipment, but in reclaiming a philosophy of intellectual and scientific excellence. Innovation must be born in the heart and mind of each student in our country. Modern India built on the framework of ancient India, which laid the foundations of mathematics and scientific revolution under the realm of spiritual enlightenment. They measured time and space. India conceived sciences of logic and grammar. India's teaching and institutions were grounded in a fundamental acknowledgement of a spiritual realm. Germany's Albert Einstein gave the world the theoretical application of Vedic knowledge in his theory of relativity. And before he died in 1955, he spoke of the soul, spirit, and he urged a Gandhian approach to non-violence and peace. In Trinidad and Tobago, we must revisit what we teach our children I propose that much of our social ills will be prevented from plaguing future generations if we explored Gandhian philosophy and meditation in our schools. Let us explore the teachings of the Vedas, the Quran, and the Upanishads, along with the Bible and the Old Testament, as we seek to leave our own legacy. Let us take a page out of the educational philosophy of India and teach all religions in our school. In fact, they have a saying, God is too big to fit into one religion. Our educational infrastructure must be prepared to respond to present and future challenges, to drive new approaches. Maybe this indeed is the paradigmatic shift that is currently being undertaken by the Ministry of Science and Tertiary Education under Minister Karim. Recent MOUs point in this direction, and for me it is a sign of hope. Material progress is not to be mistaken for inner progress, and technology must never outstrip moral development. Certainly we have come a long way. Our Indian indentured ancestors brought, not in their hands, but in their hearts and mind, we do have a very strong foundation. And in closing, I would like to thank the High Commissioner for inviting me to address you today. My historical perspective was not meant to deny or to reject, but to accept and claim. And I leave you not with an Indian quotation, but what has become one of my very favorite, as it speaks to what I believe. It was John F. Kennedy who said, "I am certain that after the dust of centuries has settled over our cities, we too will be remembered, not for our victories or defeats in battle or in politics, but for our contribution to the human spirit." I thank you.